The final verdict was delivered not with the bang of a gavel, but with the quiet, contemptuous scrape of a pen across paper. Marcus Thornwood, land agent for the Union Pacific Railroad, and therefore the de facto king of this small, wind-scoured settlement on the Nebraska plains, pushed the ledger across his desk. The ink was still wet, a dark smear that looked to Elsa like a wound that would never heal. She was 16 years old, an orphan twice over, once by fever when she was too young to remember the faces of her birth parents, and now by paperwork, by the cold arithmetic of debt and interest that had reduced her entire existence to a negative number in a leather-bound book. "The debt on this parcel incurred by your late guardians is past due," Thornwood stated. His voice was as dry as the August dust that coated everything in this godforsaken corner of the world. He did not look at her as he spoke. His gaze was fixed on the far wall of his office as if she were a mild annoyance, a fly buzzing at the edge of his perception not worth the effort of direct acknowledgement. "The company reclaims the land and the structure upon it. You have until sundown tomorrow to vacate." Elsa stood motionless in the center of the small office. The air was thick with the smells of old paper leather and the faint bitter scent of Thornwood's pipe tobacco. She was a slight figure made smaller by the worn gray dress that had belonged to her foster mother, a woman now 3 weeks in the ground beside her husband in the small cemetery at the edge of town. Her hands, already calloused from 16 years of hard work, were clasped so tightly in front of her that the knuckles had gone white. She had expected this. The whispers had followed her for weeks, snaking through the general store and the churchyard, curling around corners whenever she approached. The Hargrave girl, the orphan. What will become of her now? She had heard them all, had felt the weight of their speculation pressing down on her shoulders like a physical burden. But the finality of this moment, the absolute certainty in Thornwood's voice, was still a blow that stole the breath from her lungs. "Where am I to go?" The question came out barely above a whisper, swallowed almost immediately by the heavy silence of the room. She had not meant to ask it, had not meant to show any weakness before this man who held her fate in his ink-stained fingers. But the words escaped before she could stop them. For the first time, Thornwood's eyes met hers. They were the color of slate, cold and flat, and utterly without compassion. The eyes of a man who had long ago learned to see human beings as numbers in a ledger, as problems to be solved or assets to be acquired. There was no cruelty in those eyes, which somehow made them worse. Cruelty would have required him to see her as a person. What she saw instead was complete indifference. "That is not the company's concern," he said. "Nor is it mine. The world is large, Miss Dahl. I suggest you find a place in it that you can afford." He gave a small, dismissive gesture toward the door. The interview was over. Her entire life, everything she had known for the past 10 years, had been disposed of in less than 5 minutes. Elsa turned and walked out into the blinding prairie sun. The heat hit her like a physical force the August afternoon, pressing down on the small settlement with the weight of a blacksmith's anvil. She stood on the wooden sidewalk outside Thornwood's office and looked at the town that had been her home for as long as she could remember. It was not much to look at. A dozen rough structures clinging to the vast, unforgiving flatness of the Nebraska plains like barnacles on the hull of a ship that had run aground in an ocean of grass. There were a few log cabins, poorly chinked and drafty, built by men who had learned their craft in the forests of the East and never quite adapted to a land without trees. There were a greater number of soddies houses, cut from the very earth, their walls made of stacked prairie sod, and their roofs covered with the same. They were damp in spring, dusty in summer, and magnets for snakes and mice and all manner of crawling things year-round. They were dark and cramped and smelled of earth and decay, but they were what people knew. They were the accepted, correct way to live on the plains, the way that everyone understood and followed without question. And they all relied on the same voracious God, the cast-iron stove fed with a constant expensive diet of scavenged wood or railroad-shipped coal. Elsa had grown up understanding that winter was the true measure of a person on the plains. It did not merely visit this land, it laid siege to it. It was a white wolf that prowled for months at a time, testing every wall, every window, every soul. The stories of the previous winter were still fresh in everyone's memory. Families burning their furniture to stay warm, burning their wagon boards, their fence posts, anything that would catch fire. The hollow-eyed look of those who had survived and the absence of those who had not. Children frozen in their beds because the fire went out in the night and no one had the strength to rekindle it. Survival on the Nebraska plains was a matter of fuel, and fuel was a matter of money. Money that Elsa did not have, money that she had no way of earning, money that Thornwood knew she could never acquire, which was why he had delivered his verdict with such complete confidence. He was not just evicting her, he was executing her, and he knew it, and he did not care. 24 hours. She had been given 24 hours to become a ghost in this small, tightly knit community. An unattached girl of 16 with no family and no property and no prospects was less than nothing on the frontier. She was a problem, a potential burden, a mouth that would need feeding and a body that would need sheltering with nothing to offer in return. She could see the calculations already being made behind the eyes of the people she passed on her way back to the soddy that would be hers for only a few more hours. The women who had brought casseroles after the Hargraves died the men who had tipped their hats and offered condolences. They were already distancing themselves, already preparing the explanations they would give to their own consciences. We would have helped, but there was nothing we could do. She was too proud to ask for charity. It was God's will. To be cast out now at the tail end of summer, with autumn's chill already creeping into the morning air, was not just an eviction. It was a death sentence delivered with bureaucratic indifference and legal precision. Elsa Dahl was expected to die. She was expected to drift away from the settlement, to wander until exposure or starvation claimed her to become another unmarked grave on the endless prairie, another cautionary tale that mothers would whisper to their daughters about the importance of finding a husband and the dangers of being alone. She reached the Sadi as the sun was beginning its long descent toward the western horizon. The small structure looked different now. It had never been beautiful, but it had been home. Now it was just a temporary shelter, a place she would occupy for a few more hours before being thrust out into the unknown. She did not weep. Tears were a luxury, a waste of precious salt and water. Tears were for people who had someone to comfort them, someone who would see their grief and respond with compassion. Elsa had no one. She had only herself and a cold, hard knot of resolve that was forming in her belly like a stone. They thought she would drift away. They thought she would become another unmarked grave, another sad story told around winter fires by people who had done nothing to prevent the tragedy. They were wrong. That night in the small, dark soddy that would be hers for only a few more hours, Elsa began to pack her meager belongings. A change of clothes, a sharp knife that had belonged to her foster father, a small pot for cooking, a tinder box with flint and steel. These were the tools of survival, the absolute minimum required to stay alive on the prairie. But at the very bottom of the wooden chest that held everything she owned, her fingers brushed against something else. It was a small book bound in cracked leather that had once been fine but had long since faded to a dull brown. The pages inside were filled with tight, elegant script in a language that mixed Danish with English, the handwriting of a woman who had been learning a new tongue while trying not to forget her old one. The journal of Ingrid Dahl, her grandmother. Elsa had never known the woman. Ingrid had died long before Elsa was born in the old country, in a place called Denmark that Elsa knew only from the stories her birth parents had told before the fever took them. But somehow the journal had survived, had passed from hand to hand through the years, from her grandmother to her mother to the box of belongings that had accompanied Elsa to the Hargrave farm when she was 6 years old. She had looked at it before, of course, had puzzled over the foreign words and studied the careful drawings that filled the margins. But she had never really read it, had never had a reason to delve into the thoughts of a woman dead for decades in a country thousands of miles away. Now, with nothing left to lose and nowhere else to turn, Elsa lit a precious tallow candle and opened the journal. The first pages were ordinary enough. Daily observations about weather and crops, notes about neighbors and family members, the small details of a life lived in a cold, harsh land. Denmark, Elsa gathered, was not so different from Nebraska in some ways. Cold winters, short growing seasons, a constant battle against the elements. But then she turned a page and everything changed. There was a drawing, simple but clear, executed with the careful precision of someone who wanted to make absolutely certain the image would be understood. It showed a cross-section of a dwelling, but not like any dwelling Elsa had ever seen. This house did not stand up proud and tall, fighting against the wind. This house nestled down into the earth, yielding to it. The walls were not built on top of the ground, but carved into the side of a gentle hill. The roof was not peaked and shingled, but flat and covered with earth and grass. And above the roof, dominating the entire drawing, was a massive conical stack of hay. Jord Hus, her grandmother had written beside the drawing. Earth House. Elsa leaned closer, her heart beginning to beat faster as she studied the details. The house in the drawing was not just covered with hay, it was buried beneath it. The haystack rose 15 or 20 feet above the structure, completely concealing it from view. From the outside, looking at this drawing, you would see nothing but a hay pile, the kind of anonymous stack that farmers throughout the world used to store fodder for their animals. There was no indication that beneath all that hay there was a home where people lived. She turned the page and found more drawings, more notes, more details. The principle was explained carefully, as if Ingrid had been writing instructions for someone who might one day need them desperately. The earth itself, she had written, is the greatest blanket. Just a few feet below the surface, the ground holds a steady, constant temperature. Cool in summer, warm in winter, not hot, never hot, but far warmer than the winter air above. The earth does not create heat, but it holds heat. It remembers warmth the way a stone remembers the sun long after sunset. This is what the old ones understood. This is what we have forgotten. Elsa read on, her eyes growing wider with each page. The enemy her grandmother had written is not the cold. The enemy is heat loss. A house that stands tall and proud on the open plain is a house that offers itself up to the wind. It bleeds warmth from every crack and seam, fighting a battle it can never win. But a house that burrows into the earth is a house that is already sheltered. The wind cannot find it. The cold cannot reach it. There was a word that appeared again and again in the text, a word that Elsa did not know but that her grandmother had carefully defined in the margins. Thermal mass, the ability of a material to absorb and store heat. Earth had thermal mass, stone had thermal mass, water had thermal mass. The massive walls of an underground dwelling would absorb warmth during the day and radiate it back during the night, creating a stable, comfortable temperature without the need for constant fire. And hay was different. Hay did not store heat. Hay prevented heat from escaping. The carefully dried stalks of prairie grass her grandmother had written are filled with millions of tiny pockets of air. Air is the greatest insulator known to man. A thick layer of hay above a dwelling is like a coat of the finest quality, keeping warmth in and cold out. The deeper the hay, the better the coat. And when snow falls upon the hay, the insulation becomes even greater. Elsa sat back, her mind racing. She knew about sadis. Everyone on the plains knew about sadis. They were the standard dwelling for those who could not afford timber, cut from the prairie earth and stacked like bricks to form walls. They worked after a fashion. They were better than nothing, but they were still above ground. They still had to fight the wind. They still needed constant fire to stay warm. What her grandmother was describing was something different. Something that did not fight the elements, but hid from them. Something that used the earth itself as protection and hay as insulation and required only a fraction of the fuel that a normal dwelling would consume. She turned another page and her breath caught in her throat. There was a note there written in a different ink, clearly added later than the rest of the journal. The handwriting was shakier, the letters less precise. It was the writing of an older woman, someone whose hands no longer moved with the certainty of youth. And it was addressed to her. If you are reading this, the note began, it means you have lost everything. Good. This is the moment you have been preparing for, even if you did not know it. This is the moment when you are ready to learn what others refuse to understand. The earth remembers my child. The earth remembers everything. It remembers the heat of summer and the cold of winter. It remembers where water flows and where wind scours. It remembers the wisdom of those who came before the knowledge that civilization has forgotten in its rush toward progress. They will call you mad. They will mock you and scorn you and predict your failure. Let them. The earth does not care what they think, and neither should you. Build deep, build hidden, build to last. And when the killing cold comes, they will understand. They will all understand. Your grandmother Ingrid doll Elsa read the note 3 times, her hands trembling. Her grandmother had died decades ago before Elsa was born, before her parents had even met. But somehow the old woman had known, had seen into the future and prepared a message for a granddaughter she would never meet. A granddaughter who would one day be alone, abandoned, cast out to die on a merciless prairie. A granddaughter who would need to learn how to survive. Outside the Saudi, the night wind was picking up, carrying the first hints of autumn cold. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled at the rising moon. The sounds of the prairie at night, the vast empty darkness that surrounded this tiny settlement like an ocean surrounding an island. Elsa closed the journal and pressed it against her chest. She had been given a death sentence, but she had also been given a gift. A map to survival written by a woman who had faced the same kind of cold, the same kind of hardship, the same kind of dismissal by those who thought they knew better. A plan began to form in her mind. It was audacious. It was desperate. It was the kind of plan that only someone with nothing left to lose would even consider. It was her only chance. The next morning, Elsa did not walk east along the railroad tracks toward the next town seeking work as a domestic servant or a shop girl. She did not walk west toward the mountains chasing rumors of gold or silver or any of the other dreams that drew desperate people into the wilderness. She walked north, away from the settlement, away from the judgmental eyes and the wagging tongues, away from everyone and everything she had ever known. She walked to a piece of unclaimed land about half a mile from town, a place that no one wanted, a shallow depression where a small, marshy creek ran during the spring thaw before drying up entirely in the summer heat. The soil was poor there, too wet in spring and too dry in summer for reliable farming. The location was too far from town for convenient commerce. But on the southern edge of that depression, there was a gentle slope, a rise in the ground no more than 10 or 12 feet high facing south toward the sun. It was nothing that anyone would look at twice, just a small hill on a prairie full of small hills. To Elsa, it was perfect. She set down the bundle of belongings she had carried from the Saudi. She looked at the hill, at the angle of the slope, at the position of the sun overhead. She thought about everything she had read in her grandmother's journal about thermal mass and insulation and the constant temperature of the earth just a few feet below the surface. Then she picked up the battered spade that she had claimed as her own from the Hargrave farm, and she began to dig. The first cut into the prairie sod was like cutting into flesh. The blade of the spade sank into the earth with a sound that was almost organic, a wet tearing noise that seemed to come from something alive. And in a way, it was alive. The prairie was not just dirt. It was a living thing, a vast organism of interlocking roots and stems and soil that had been building itself for thousands of years. The sod was thick, thicker than Elsa had expected. The roots of the prairie grass formed a dense mat that went down a foot or more, tangled together like rope, resistant to any attempt to separate them. Each spadeful was a battle. She would drive the metal blade in with her foot, putting her entire weight behind the thrust, then lever the handle back to tear a chunk of earth free. The chunk would come up, reluctantly trailing roots like severed veins, still connected to the earth by 1,000 tiny threads. She would have to saw at these connections with the edge of the spade, cutting them one by one until the sod block was finally free. Then she would flip it over, set it aside, and begin again. The work was brutal. The late summer sun beat down on her back without mercy, raising blisters beneath her thin dress. Sweat poured down her face, stinging her eyes, dripping from her chin onto the earth she was trying to move. Her arms, strong from years of farm work, but not conditioned for this specific labor, began to burn with fatigue within the first hour. By noon, her hands were raw. The wooden handle of the spade had worn through the calluses she had built up over years of work, exposing fresh skin beneath that quickly blistered and tore. Blood mixed with dirt on her palms, creating a reddish-brown mud that made the handle slippery and hard to grip. By sundown, her hands were ruined. Great patches of skin had been torn away, leaving angry red wounds that throbbed with every heartbeat. Her back screamed in protest every time she bent to lift another load. Her arms felt like they were filled with lead, heavy and clumsy, and barely responsive to her commands. And she had managed to clear a patch of sod perhaps 6 feet square. She had only begun to break into the darker soil beneath the root layer. The hole she had dug was barely knee-deep, a pathetic scratch on the face of the immense prairie. A child could have jumped across it. A dog could have leaped out of it without effort. It looked like nothing. It was nothing. Elsa stood at the edge of her tiny excavation and felt the full weight of the task she had undertaken pressing down on her shoulders. The hill she intended to burrow into rose before her, massive and indifferent. The prairie stretched out in every direction, endless and empty and uncaring. She wanted to collapse, wanted to lie down in the dirt and let the coming night take her. Wanted to give up, to admit that Thornwood had been right, that she was nothing, that she had no place in this world except beneath its surface. She thought about the town behind her, about the people who were probably sitting down to dinner, right now warm and fed and secure. She thought about Thornwood, who was probably already filling out the paperwork to sell the Hargrave property to someone more suitable. She thought about what they would say when they found her body out here frozen, or starved, or simply given up. Another cautionary tale, another sad story to tell round the fire. Poor thing. She tried, but she was never going to make it. Better for everyone that it ended quickly. And then she thought about her grandmother, about the note in the journal, about the words that seemed to reach across decades and continents to speak directly to her. They will call you mad. They will mock you and scorn you and predict your failure. Let them. The earth does not care what they think, and neither should you. Elsa picked up the spade again. Her hands screamed in protest. Her back spasmed with pain. Every fiber of her being demanded that she stop, that she rest, that she acknowledge the impossibility of what she was attempting. She ignored all of it. She drove the spade into the earth again, and again, and again. The rhythm of the work became everything. There was no past and no future. There was only the present moment, the blade cutting into soil, the handle in her bleeding hands, the chunk of earth rising and falling. The hole grew deeper, inch by painful inch, and the stars wheeled overhead, and the night grew cold around her, and still she dug. When she finally stopped somewhere in the small hours of the morning, she had doubled the size of her excavation. It was still pathetically small, still nothing compared to what needed to be done. But it was progress. She collapsed beside the hole, wrapped herself in the thin blanket she had brought, and slept the dreamless sleep of absolute exhaustion. The days that followed blurred together into a single endless ordeal of digging. Elsa fell into a state of pure physical existence, stripped of everything except the work. Wake, dig, sleep. That was her life. That was all of her life. The world outside her small excavation ceased to exist. Her body began to change. The soft places hardened. The muscles that had been adequate for farm work became something different, something stronger and more specialized. Her hands went through a transformation that felt like a small death and rebirth. The blisters burst and bled and became infected and healed, and were replaced by calluses so thick and hard they were almost like leather gloves grown from her own flesh. She grew gaunt. The food she had brought was never enough, and she supplemented it with whatever she could find. Wild berries growing in the creek bottom, late-season roots dug from the prairie, the occasional rabbit that wandered too close and paid for its curiosity with its life. It was not enough. It was never enough. She could feel her body consuming itself, burning through reserves of fat and then muscle to fuel the endless work of moving earth. Her dress, already loose when she started, now hung off her frame like a sack. Her face grew thin, her cheekbones prominent, her eyes large in a face that seemed to be shrinking around them. But she did not stop, could not stop. Stopping meant dying, and she had decided that she was not going to die. The town noticed. At first, it was just curiosity. Children would wander out from the settlement, and in the afternoon, their chores completed, looking for entertainment. They would stand at the edge of the depression and watch the strange girl digging a hole in the middle of nowhere. They did not understand what she was doing. Neither did anyone else. They just watched the way people watch any unusual event, waiting to see what would happen next. Then the adults came. They came one at a time, at first riding out on horses or walking during their lunch breaks, drawn by the stories their children told. They would stand at the edge of Elsa's excavation, which by now was deep enough that she had to look up to see them, and they would shake their heads and mutter to each other. The consensus was unanimous. The girl had lost her mind. Grief and desperation had driven her to madness, and she was digging her own grave on the prairie. Virgil Crandall was the first to say it to her face. Crandall was the town's master builder, a title he had given himself, but that no one disputed. He was a big man, broad-shouldered and loud-voiced, with hands like hams and a stomach that spoke of prosperity. His log cabins were considered the pinnacle of frontier architecture, solid structures that could withstand anything the prairie could throw at them. He rode out on a fine chestnut horse one afternoon, nearly 2 weeks after Elsa had begun her work. By then, the pit was waist-deep and roughly rectangular, about 12 feet long and 10 feet wide. She had begun to shape it, squaring the corners and leveling the floor, following the plans in her grandmother's journal. Crandall sat astride his horse, looking down at her in the pit, his face arranged in an expression of amused contempt. "What is this girl," he called down, "digging your own grave to save us the trouble?" Elsa paused in her work. She was covered in dirt from head to toe, her dress stained beyond any hope of cleaning, her hair matted with sweat and soil. She looked up at the man on the horse, and her eyes were steady. "I am building a house," she said. Crandall laughed. It was a loud, booming sound that carried on the wind, the laugh of a man who was absolutely certain of his own superiority. "A house," he repeated. "A mud hole is what it looks like. You will be drowned in the spring melt and frozen by Christmas. There is no room for a stove in that pit. You will suffocate on the smoke before you freeze to death." "I will have a chimney," Elsa said quietly. "A chimney." Crandall slapped his thigh, delighted by the absurdity of it. A chimney for a gopher hole. He shook his head, the smirk on his face curdling into something that might have been pity. "Listen to me, girl. This is folly. Woman's folly of the worst kind. You cannot fight a Nebraska winter with a shovel and a prayer. You need timber and iron and sense. You have none of the three. Go back to town. Find someone to take you in. This," he gestured at the hole, "is nothing but a slow way to die." Elsa looked at him for a long moment. Then she bent back to her work, driving the spade into the earth with a force that made Crandall's horse take a nervous step backward. He waited for a response that did not come. After a minute, he turned his horse and rode away, already rehearsing the story he would tell at the general store that evening. The name he gave her work spread through the settlement like wildfire. Elsa's Folly. That was what everyone called it now. The crazy orphan girl and her folly out there digging in the dirt like a mole, like a creature that had forgotten it was supposed to walk upright and live in houses like a civilized person. It became a local joke, a piece of gossip that people trotted out whenever conversation lagged. "Have you seen Elsa's Folly lately?" "Deeper than ever. She will be in China by Christmas, if she does not freeze first." The laughter cut deeper than Elsa wanted to admit, but she did not stop. She could not stop. The hole was her future, the only future she had left. If she abandoned it, she would have nothing. Marcus Thornwood heard the stories, of course. In a settlement this small, everyone heard everything eventually. And being the man he was, he could not resist the opportunity to witness the validation of his judgment. He rode out in his buggy one afternoon about 3 weeks after the eviction. By then the pit was over Elsa's head. She had to climb out using handholds she had cut into the walls, and the excavated earth had formed a substantial mound beside the hole. Thornwood did not dismount from his buggy. He sat on the leather seat, his slate-gray eyes surveying the scene with cold satisfaction. He had been right. The girl was mad. Nature would take its course, and the problem would resolve itself. "I see you found your place in the world," he called down to her. His voice dripped with sarcasm. At the bottom of it, Elsa looked up at him from the pit. Her face was expressionless, but her eyes burned with something that made Thornwood shift uncomfortably in his seat. "Do not expect the company to bury you when the first snow falls," he continued, recovering his composure. "You chose this. Whatever happens next is your own doing." He waited for her to respond, to plead, to beg, to show some sign of the desperation that must surely be consuming her. She did not give him the satisfaction. She simply turned back to her work, driving the spade into the earth with a steady, relentless rhythm. The sound of metal cutting into soil followed Thornwood all the way back to town, a mocking percussion that seemed to question everything he thought he knew. The pit grew deeper, the work grew harder, and Elsa Dahl kept digging, carving her survival from the bedrock of their scorn. But she was not entirely alone. Nell Crandall was 10 years old, the youngest daughter of the master builder who had mocked Elsa so thoroughly. She was a curious child, always asking questions that her parents found annoying, always poking into corners where she was not supposed to go. She had heard her father's stories about Elsa's folly, had heard him laughing about the crazy girl in the pit, had seen the contempt in his eyes when he spoke of her. And something about that contempt bothered Nell in ways she could not quite articulate. "Why is it so funny?" she had asked her father once. "Because it is foolish," he had replied. "Because she is doing something that cannot possibly work. She will freeze to death, and everyone knows it except her." "But how do you know it will not work?" Nell had pressed. "Have you tried it?" Her father had given her a look that shut down any further questions, but the questions stayed in Nell's mind, turning over and over like a stone in a stream. The first time she went to see Elsa's folly for herself, she told herself she was just curious, just wanted to see what all the fuss was about. She snuck away from her chores on a Tuesday afternoon and walked the half-mile to the depression where the orphan girl was digging. What she saw surprised her. It was not just a hole in the ground. It was a room, a rectangular space with smooth walls and a level floor dug into the side of the gentle slope. The girl was working in a smaller space at the back, a tunnel that seemed to be going deeper into the hill itself. She was small, this girl, smaller than Nell had expected, given all the work she had accomplished. And she looked hungry, really hungry in a way that made Nell's stomach tighten with sympathy. Nell watched for a long time hidden behind a clump of prairie grass. She watched the girl dig with that steady, relentless rhythm, never stopping, never resting. She watched her wipe sweat from her forehead with a hand that was more callous than skin. She watched her pause occasionally to consult a small book that she kept wrapped in cloth near the entrance to the pit. The next day, Nell came back. She brought bread, a small loaf that she had taken from the kitchen, telling herself that no one would notice that there was plenty and one loaf would not be missed. She did not give it to the girl directly. That would have required speaking to her, and Nell was not quite brave enough for that. Instead, she left it at the edge of the pit, wrapped in a cloth, and then ran away before she could be seen. The day after that, she watched from her hiding place as the girl climbed out of the pit, found the bread, and looked around with an expression that Nell could not quite read. Surprise, certainly, but also something else, something that looked almost like hope. The bread was gone by the next morning. Nell brought more, and water, this time in a small skin that she had smuggled from her father's workshop. A pattern established itself. Nell would come in the afternoons when her chores were done and before dinner. She would leave food and water at the edge of the pit. She would watch the girl work, marveling at the transformation taking place. The room grew deeper. The tunnel at the back became a small alcove, a sheltered space that disappeared into the hillside. Wooden beams appeared scavenged from somewhere laid across the top of the pit to form the beginning of a roof. Layers of material covered the beams, plastered with something that looked like mud, but smelled different, sharper. And then the hay began to arrive. Nell watched in fascination as the girl cut grass from the prairie, bundled it into sheaves, and carried it to the site. Load after load, day after day. The hay accumulated in a pile beside the pit, golden and fragrant, waiting for its purpose. One afternoon, Nell got too close. She was so absorbed in watching the girl wrestle a particularly large bundle of hay that she did not notice she had left the cover of the prairie grass until she was standing in the open, fully visible. The girl looked up. Their eyes met. Nell froze, terrified. Her father would be furious if he knew she had been coming here. He would punish her, probably, would certainly forbid her from ever returning. But the girl did not shout at her, did not chase her away. She just looked at Nell with those dark, steady eyes, and then she spoke. "You are the one who has been leaving food." It was not a question. Nell nodded, unable to find her voice. The girl considered this for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you." And she went back to work as if the interruption had never happened. Nell did not run away. She stayed watching, and after a while she found the courage to speak. "My father says you will freeze to death." The girl did not look up from her work. She kept bundling hay, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. "He is wrong," she said. Her voice was flat, without emotion. A statement of fact, not an argument. "How do you know?" "Because I have read the words of someone who understood the earth, and because your father builds houses that fight the wind while I am building a house the wind cannot find." Nell thought about this. It was a strange idea, a house that hid from the wind, but there was something about the way the girl said it that made it sound reasonable, made it sound possible. "Can I help?" The words came out before Nell could stop them. The girl paused in her work. She looked at Nell, really looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. "Your father would not approve. I do not care what my father approves." For the first time, something like a smile crossed the girl's face. It was gone, almost immediately replaced by that expression of steady determination. But Nell had seen it. "Then yes," the girl said, "you can help." That was how Nell Crandall became a secret conspirator in the construction of Elsa's Folly. She could not do the heavy work, the digging and hauling and lifting that Elsa did day after day, but she could do other things. She brought supplies, small things that would not be missed from her family's stores: salt, matches, needles and thread, a piece of canvas that had been discarded because of a small tear. Each item was a gift, a contribution to a project that Nell did not fully understand but believed in anyway. And she brought information, news from the town, what people were saying about Elsa, what her father was planning. When Thornwood was going to ride out again to gloat, "Your father says you will be dead by Christmas," Nell reported one afternoon. Elsa nodded, unsurprised. "What do you say?" Nell asked. Elsa looked up from the bundle of hay she was tying. Her eyes were tired but clear. Her face was thin, almost gaunt, but there was strength in it that had not been there before. "I say that Christmas is still far away," Elsa replied, "and I have a great deal of work to do before then." She turned back to her task, and Nell watched her work, and outside the wind began to pick up as the first real cold of autumn crept across the plains. By the time the first frosts of October silvered the prairie grass, the transformation was complete. Where there had once been a hole in the ground, there was now something else entirely. Something that did not look like a house, did not look like any dwelling that the people of the settlement had ever seen. Something that looked from the outside like nothing more than a massive pile of hay. The haystack rose 15 feet above the ground, conical in shape, wider at the base, and tapering to a rough peak at the top. It was enormous, far larger than any fodder pile that a normal farmer would construct. But it was also anonymous. It was invisible. It looked like exactly what it appeared to be, a storage pile for animal feed, unremarkable and uninteresting. No one passing by would guess that beneath all that hay, beneath the layers of earth and clay and waterproofed hide, there was a home, a space carved from the living earth, sheltered from the wind, insulated from the cold, waiting for the winter, that everyone said would kill the girl who built it. The entrance was hidden at the base of the haystack, a low, narrow tunnel concealed by the fall of hay. You would have to know exactly where to look to find it. You would have to push through layers of dried grass, crawl through a passage barely wide enough for a human body, before you emerged into the small, dark space within. Elsa had done it, had built something from nothing, from a hole in the ground, and the wisdom of a dead woman, and sheer stubborn refusal to give up. Now she had to survive what was coming. She spent the last weeks of autumn preparing for the siege. She gathered more grass for fuel, twisting it into tight, slow-burning logs that would smolder for hours in her small clay stove. She snared rabbits and smoked the meat over low fires, building a store of protein that would last through the cold months. She foraged the last of the wild onions and prairie turnips, storing them in the cool, stable temperature of her underground home. The days grew shorter, the nights grew colder. The wind that had been a nuisance became something else, a living force that prowled across the plains with increasing aggression. The town had mostly forgotten her by now. The joke of Elsa's folly had grown stale. There were other things to worry about as winter approached. Fuel to gather, food to preserve, animals to prepare for the cold. The consensus was that she had either died or wandered off. Either way, she was no longer their concern. Marcus Thornwood, closing his ledgers for the year, felt a grim satisfaction. The problem had solved itself, as he had always known it would. Nature had tidied up the loose end that the company had created. He did not give another thought to the orphan girl he had cast out to die. He should have. Outside his warm office, the wind was picking up. Far to the north, beyond the horizon, clouds were beginning to gather. The winter of 1888 was preparing its assault. And beneath a pile of hay half a mile from a town that had abandoned her, a 16-year-old girl sat by her clay stove and listened to the wind and waited. She had done everything she could, had followed her grandmother's instructions to the letter, had built a house that the wind could not find in a place where the earth would remember warmth even when the sky forgot it. Now all she could do was wait and hope and trust that the wisdom of the old ones would prove stronger than the cruelty of the new. The first snowflakes began to fall as October turned to November. They drifted down through the cold air and landed on the massive haystack, adding another layer of insulation to the dwelling hidden beneath. Inside, Elsa watched the orange glow of her clay stove and thought about all the people who had predicted her death. She thought about Thornwood with his cold slate eyes and his ledger of debts. She thought about Crandall with his booming laugh and his certainty that she was doing something impossible. She thought about all the whispered conversations and the knowing looks and the assumption that she would simply drift away and become another unmarked grave on the prairie. She thought about all of them, and in the warmth of her underground home, surrounded by the silence of the earth, she smiled. They had no idea what was coming, but she did, and she was ready. The first true snow of winter arrived in the second week of November, falling silent and thick through the night, and transforming the prairie into an endless white sea by morning. Elsa woke to a world muffled and still. The sounds that normally penetrated her underground dwelling, the wind across the grass, the distant calls of birds, the occasional rumble of a wagon on the road to town, had all disappeared. In their place was a silence so profound it felt almost sacred. She pushed through the entrance tunnel and emerged into a landscape that had been completely remade overnight. The haystack above her home was now a smooth white mound, indistinguishable from the snow-covered hills around it. The depression where she had built was filled with drifts that sparkled in the pale morning light. The world was clean and cold and beautiful and deadly. Never forget that. Beautiful but deadly. She gathered an armful of snow, packed it into the pot she used for melting water, and retreated back into her shelter. The clay stove was still warm from the night's fire, and she fed it a handful of twisted grass to bring the flames back to life. This was her rhythm now, the rhythm of survival. Wake, check the fire, melt snow for water, eat something small from her stores, tend to the endless small tasks that kept her alive. The underground dwelling had proven everything her grandmother's journal had promised. The temperature inside remained steady regardless of what was happening above. When the air outside dropped below freezing, the earthen walls of her home held their warmth like a mother holding a child. When the wind howled across the plains, it passed over her haystack and without finding purchase, without stealing the precious heat she had generated. She burned less fuel than she had expected. The small clay stove, no bigger than a pumpkin, needed only a handful of grass twists every hour to maintain a comfortable warmth. Her massive stockpile of twisted grass logs, which she had worried might not be enough, now seemed almost excessive. The ventilation system worked exactly as her grandmother had described. The smoke from her fire was drawn through the buried stone-lined channel emerging from the earth a dozen feet away from her dwelling, dispersing low to the ground and becoming almost invisible against the white landscape. The separate air intake pipe brought fresh, cold air directly to the stove where it was warmed before circulating through her living space. She could breathe. She could stay warm. She could survive. But survival was not just a matter of temperature and oxygen. It was also a matter of sanity. The days were short now and growing shorter. The sun rose late and set early, and even during its brief appearance, it was often hidden behind clouds. Her underground home was dark lit only by what little light filtered down the entrance tunnel and by the orange glow of her clay stove. She had candles, a precious few, that she rationed carefully. She had her grandmother's journal, which she read again and again until she had memorized every word. She had her thoughts, which were not always friendly company. The isolation pressed in on her during those first weeks of winter. She was utterly alone, more alone than she had ever been in her life. There was no one to talk to, no one to share the small victories and setbacks of daily survival, no one to remind her that she was still a human being and not just a creature huddled in a hole. She talked to herself sometimes, narrated her actions aloud just to hear a voice in the darkness. Now I am going to check the stores. Everything looks good. The rabbit meat is holding well. The turnips are still firm. She talked to her grandmother, too, to the journal that was her only connection to another human mind. You were right, she would say, tracing the faded ink with her fingers. You were right about everything. And in the silence that followed, she would imagine she could hear Ingrid's voice responding, encouraging her, reminding her that she was not as alone as she felt. The earth remembers. And so do I, child. So do I. November turned to December. The snows continued to fall, accumulating in drifts that grew higher each week. The world above her shelter became a frozen wasteland, scoured by winds that would kill an exposed human in minutes. Elsa ventured out only when necessary, to gather more snow for water, to check that the ventilation pipes were not blocked, to stretch her legs and remind herself that there was still a world beyond the earthen walls of her home. Each time she emerged, the landscape had changed. New drifts had formed, old ones had shifted. The haystack that covered her dwelling was now indistinguishable from the terrain around it, a white hill among white hills, anonymous and invisible. No one came looking for her. No one even thought about her as far as she could tell. She was a forgotten problem, a closed file in Thornwood's ledger, a joke that had stopped being funny months ago. That was fine. That was exactly what she wanted. Let them forget. Let them assume she was dead. Let them go about their lives in their drafty cabins and their smoky soddies burning through their carefully hoarded fuel, never suspecting that half a mile away a 16-year-old girl was living better than any of them. But the isolation still wore on her, still pressed against her mind like a physical weight. There were days when she did not speak a single word aloud, when the only sounds she heard were the crackle of her fire and the beat of her own heart. There were nights when she lay away in the darkness, listening to the silence, feeling the weight of all the earth above her, and wondering if she would ever see another human face again. Then Nell came. It was a morning in mid-December, gray and cold, but not actively storming. Elsa was sitting by her stove, mending a tear in her dress, when she heard something that made her freeze. Footsteps, crunching through the snow above her head. Her heart began to pound. No one knew where her entrance was. No one should be able to find it. But someone was up there, moving around, getting closer. She reached for her knife, the one possession she had kept through everything. It was not much of a weapon, but it was better than nothing. She positioned herself near the entrance tunnel, ready to defend her home against whatever was coming. A small figure appeared in the tunnel opening. A child bundled in a heavy coat and scarf, crawling through on hands and knees. Nell Crandall emerged into the main chamber and looked around with wide eyes. "You are alive," she said. It was half statement, half question, as if she had not quite believed it until this moment. Elsa lowered the knife. The tension drained out of her, replaced by something she had not expected to feel. Relief. Pure, overwhelming relief at seeing another human face. "I am alive," she confirmed. "How did you find me?" Nell was still looking around, taking in the small clay stove, the strings of smoked meat hanging from the ceiling beams, the neat piles of supplies arranged along the earthen walls. "I remembered where you were digging," she said, "and I saw the smoke coming out of the ground a few weeks ago. Just a little bit early in the morning when the air was still. I followed it." Elsa felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. If Nell could find her, so could others. So could people who did not wish her well. "Does anyone else know?" Nell shook her head. "No, I have not told anyone." She paused, her young face serious. "My father still thinks you are dead. He says the snow took you weeks ago. He says it was God's mercy ending your suffering quickly. And what do you say?" Nell looked around the small, warm room again. Then she looked at Elsa, and there was something in her eyes that was older than her 10 years. "I say my father does not know everything," she said, "even if he thinks he does." Despite everything, Elsa smiled. It was the first genuine smile that had crossed her face in weeks. "Come," she said, "sit by the fire. You must be cold from the walk." Nell settled herself near the stove, holding out her small hands to warm them. She had brought something Elsa noticed. A bundle wrapped in cloth, which she now held out. "I brought food," she said. "Some bread and cheese, and salt pork. Mother will not miss it." Elsa took the bundle and felt its weight. It was more food than she had seen in weeks, real food, not the smoked rabbit and wild roots that had been sustaining her. "Thank you," she said. The words seemed inadequate for what she was feeling. "You take a great risk coming here." Nell shrugged, a gesture that seemed too adult for her small frame. "Father says risk is what makes life worth living." She paused, considering. "He usually says it when he is about to do something foolish. But I think sometimes foolish things are worth doing." She looked around the chamber again, her eyes lingering on the clay stove, the ventilation pipes, the careful construction that had turned a hole in the ground into a habitable home. "How is it warm in here?" she asked. "Father says you cannot heat a hole in the ground. He says the earth will steal all the warmth and leave you frozen." "Your father builds houses that fight the wind," Elsa said. She pulled her grandmother's journal from its protective wrapping and opened it to one of the diagrams. "I built a house that hides from it." She explained as simply as she could the principles that Ingrid had taught her. The thermal mass of the earth, the insulating properties of hay, the way the underground temperature remained constant while the air above swung wildly between extremes. Nell listened with the intensity of a child who has discovered something that contradicts everything she has been told. "So the earth holds the warmth?" she asked. "Like a blanket." "Like a blanket," Elsa confirmed, "and the hay keeps the blanket from being pulled away by the wind." Nell was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. Then she said Father would not believe it. He would say it was impossible. "And yet here we are," Elsa replied, "warm and safe while the wind howls above us." Nell nodded slowly. Then with the directness of childhood, she asked the question that had clearly been on her mind. Why did you help me before when I was bringing you food? You could have told me to go away. You could have been angry that I was watching you. Elsa considered the question. It was a fair one. She had every reason to resent this child, the daughter of the man who had mocked her most viciously. Because you were kind, she said finally. In a world that has shown me very little kindness, you chose to help. That is not something I forget. Nell's face flushed with pleasure at the praise. She looked down at her hands, suddenly shy. I should go, she said. Father will wonder where I am if I am gone too long. She stood and moved toward the entrance tunnel, then paused and looked back. Can I come again? She asked. To see you, to make sure you are still, she hesitated, alive. Elsa felt something warm in her chest, something she had not felt in a very long time. Yes, she said, you can come again. Nell smiled a bright, genuine smile that lit up her young face. Then she was gone, crawling back through the tunnel and emerging into the frozen world above. Elsa sat by her fire for a long time after the girl left, turning the bundle of food over in her hands. She was not alone anymore. She had an ally, a small one, young and powerless in many ways, but an ally nonetheless. It was more than she had expected, more than she had dared to hope for. The winter continued its assault. December brought storms that lasted for days, blizzards that buried the landscape under feet of fresh snow. January was worse, a relentless cold that seemed to seep into everything that made the air itself feel hostile. In the town, people struggled. The fuel supplies that had seemed adequate in autumn were dwindling faster than expected. The cold was more intense than usual, and the stoves had to be fed constantly to maintain livable temperatures. Families burned through their wood piles, then their fence posts, then their furniture. The hollow-eyed look of fear began to appear on faces that had been confident just weeks before. Elsa knew about this because Nell told her. The girl came every week or two whenever she could slip away without being noticed. She brought food when she could, information always. And she brought something else, something that Elsa had not realized she needed until it was offered. Companionship. They would sit by the clay stove, the 10-year-old and the 16-year-old, and they would talk about the town and its inhabitants, about Nell's family and their struggles, about Elsa's grandmother and the wisdom she had left behind. Father is worried, Nell reported during one visit in late January. He does not say so, but I can tell. The wood is almost gone, and there is no more to buy. Mr. Thornwood's supply wagon was supposed to come last week, but the roads are blocked with snow. Elsa nodded. She had suspected as much. The infrastructure that the town depended on, the railroads and wagon roads and supply lines, were not built to handle a winter this severe. What about the Saudis, she asked. Are they holding up better than the cabins? Nell shook her head. They are worse, actually. Father says the earth walls are bleeding cold. Whatever warmth people make inside just gets sucked away. Because they are above ground, Elsa said. Because the walls are exposed to the air on both sides. The earth cannot hold warmth if it is constantly being stolen. She thought about this, about the fundamental flaw in the way people built on the plains. They understood that sod was a good building material, better than nothing. But they did not understand why. They did not understand the principle behind it. If they dug down instead of building up, Elsa mused half to herself. If they buried themselves properly with enough insulation above. Father would never do that, Nell said. He says a man should stand tall against the elements, not hide from them like a mole. And how is that working out for him? Nell was quiet for a moment. Then in a small voice she said, not well. We are burning the chairs now. Mother cries when she thinks we are not looking. Elsa felt a pang of something that might have been sympathy. These people had treated her badly, had mocked her and abandoned her and left her to die. But they were still people. They were still suffering. She pushed the feeling aside. There was nothing she could do for them. Even if she wanted to help, even if she could somehow convince them to listen, she did not have the resources to feed or shelter the entire town. All she could do was survive and hope that when the winter finally ended, there would still be someone left to see what she had accomplished. The days crawled by. February arrived, bringing no relief from the cold. If anything, the weather seemed to be growing more severe, as if winter had decided to make a final all-out assault on the land before surrendering to spring. And then on a morning that began like any other, everything changed. Elsa woke to a strange sensation. The air in her dwelling felt different somehow. Warmer than usual, but also heavier, more humid. There was a quality to it that she could not quite identify, a tension that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. She climbed out through the entrance tunnel and emerged into a world that did not make sense. It was warm, not just less cold than it had been, actually warm. The air that touched her face was soft and mild like a spring morning. The snow around her was beginning to soften, becoming wet and heavy instead of dry and powdery. She looked up at the sky and saw a pale blue hazed with a thin layer of cloud. The sun was visible, a weak disk behind the haze, but it seemed impossibly bright after the endless gray of the previous weeks. Something was wrong. This was not normal. This was not how Nebraska winters worked. She had read about this in her grandmother's journal. Fall springs, Ingrid had called them. Warm spells in the middle of winter caused by shifts in the air, currents by warm air from the south, pushing temporarily into the frozen north. They were dangerous, these fall springs, not because of the warmth itself, but because of what came after. The cold always returned. And when it did, it returned with a vengeance. The warmer the fall spring, her grandmother had written, the more severe the cold that follows. The atmosphere seeks balance. What is gained must be repaid. Elsa retreated back into her shelter, her mind racing. She checked her stores, checked her fuel supply, made sure everything was secure, everything was ready. She did not know exactly what was coming, but she knew it would be bad. That day, February 12th, 1888, began with deceptive mildness. In the town, people emerged from their freezing homes and marveled at the warmth. Children who had been trapped indoors for weeks were sent to school without their heavy coats. Farmers ventured out to check on livestock that had been neglected during the worst of the storms. Women opened windows to air out rooms that had grown stale and smoky from months of close confinement. It felt like a gift, a mercy granted by a God who had finally taken pity on his suffering children. It was a trap. Elsa stayed underground, watching the temperature inside her dwelling rise slightly as the warmer air above began to penetrate. She paced the small space, unable to shake the feeling of impending disaster. Around noon, she climbed out again to check the sky. What she saw made her blood run cold. To the north on the horizon, there was a wall of darkness. Not clouds exactly. This was something different. Something worse, a churning, roiling mass of black and gray that seemed to swallow the sky itself. It stretched from one end of the horizon to the other, and it was moving south with terrifying speed. Elsa had never seen anything like it, but she knew what it was. A blizzard. The worst kind of blizzard. What the old-timers called a blue norther, a storm that came without warning and killed everything in its path. She scrambled back into her shelter, her heart pounding. She sealed the entrance behind her, packing extra hay around the woven willow door. She checked the ventilation pipes one more time, making sure they were clear, making sure she would be able to breathe when the storm hit. Then she sat down by her clay stove and waited. She did not have to wait long. The storm hit like a physical blow, a wall of force that seemed to make the very earth shudder. The sound was like nothing Elsa had ever heard, a roaring, screaming chaos that penetrated even the thick layers of earth and hay that separated her from the outside world. The temperature in her shelter dropped, but only slightly. The walls held. The insulation did its job. The earth remembered its warmth, just as her grandmother had promised. But Elsa knew that outside in the world she could no longer see people were dying. She thought about Nell, about the little girl who had shown her kindness when no one else would. Was she safe? Had she made it home before the storm hit? Or was she out there somewhere lost in the white screaming chaos, freezing to death? While her father's proud cabin failed to protect her, she thought about the children who had been sent to school that morning, the ones who had left their coats at home because the weather was so mild. How many of them would make it back? How many would be found frozen in the spring thaw, small bodies preserved in attitudes of struggle or surrender? She thought about Thornwood sitting in his office watching his precious railroad line disappear beneath the snow. About Crandall huddled in his masterpiece cabin, watching the frost creep across the interior walls as his stockpile of furniture fuel dwindled to nothing. She thought about all the people who had mocked her, who had predicted her death, who had written her off as a casualty of her own foolishness. They were the ones dying now. They were the ones who had built wrong, who had trusted in timber and iron and brute force. They were the ones who had refused to listen to the wisdom of the earth. The storm raged above her, and Elsa sat in her small, warm room, and she felt something that surprised her. Not satisfaction, not vindication, not the cruel joy of watching her enemies suffer. She felt sorrow. Because despite everything, despite the cruelty and the mockery and the abandonment, these were still human beings. They were still people with families and hopes and fears. They were still her neighbors in a sense, the only community she had ever known. And they were dying because they had been too proud to learn. The blizzard continued for 2 days. 2 days of screaming wind and driving ice. 2 days of temperatures so cold that exposed flesh would freeze solid in minutes. 2 days of absolute impenetrable whiteness, a world reduced to nothing but the storm itself. Inside her shelter, Elsa maintained her routine. She fed the clay stove. She melted snow for water. She ate her carefully rationed supplies. She read her grandmother's journal by the glow of the fire, drawing comfort from the familiar words. The air in her dwelling remained fresh and breathable, circulating through the ventilation system exactly as designed. The temperature remained stable, cool but not cold, comfortable enough to sleep and work and live. She was safe. She was warm. She was going to survive. But she could not shake the images that haunted her, the children caught in the open, the families burning their last sticks of furniture, the desperation that must be gripping the entire settlement as the storm showed no signs of letting up. And she thought about what would come after. The storm would end eventually. It always did, and when it ended, the people who had survived would face a reckoning. They would have to confront what had happened, what they had lost, what they had failed to prepare for. They would have to change, or they would die. When the wind finally began to subside on the morning of the third day, Elsa climbed out into a world that had been completely transformed. The snow was piled in drifts higher than her head. The landscape that she had known with its gentle hills and shallow valleys had been reshaped into something alien and unrecognizable. There were no landmarks visible, no signs of human habitation, just white, endless, white, stretching to the horizon in every direction. She looked toward the town and saw nothing. No buildings, no smoke, no signs of life, just snow piled higher than any structure that might be hidden beneath it. For a long moment, Elsa stood in the bitter cold and wondered if she was the only person left alive. Then she saw movement, a dark shape emerging from a drift struggling through the snow toward her. She tensed, reaching for the knife at her belt. But as the figure drew closer, she recognized it. Nell. The girl was half frozen, her face blue with cold, her movements clumsy and uncoordinated. But she was alive. She had found her way through the aftermath of the storm to the one place she knew might offer shelter. Elsa ran to meet her, catching the child as she collapsed into the snow. "Please, Nell," whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please help us. My family is dying." Elsa looked over Nell's shoulder toward the town that was buried somewhere beneath the drifts. Then she looked down at the girl in her arms, the ally who had shown her kindness when no one else would. And she made a decision. "Bring them," she said. "Bring everyone who can make the journey. There is room." It was a lie in a way. There was not room. Her shelter was tiny, designed for one person, not for the refugees of a devastated town. But there was warmth, there was safety, there was survival. And that would have to be enough. The journey back to the town was a nightmare of snow and cold and desperate determination. Elsa half-carried Nell through drifts that reached above their waists, following the girls' vague directions toward where the settlement should be. The wind had died down, but the cold remained brutal, a knife-edge stillness that cut through clothing and flesh and bone. They found the first body after 20 minutes of struggling. A man frozen solid in a drift, his arms outstretched as if reaching for something that was no longer there. His face was blue-white, his eyes open and staring at nothing. He had died within sight of town, probably trying to make his way home when the storm hit. Elsa did not recognize him. She guided Nell past the body without comment, shielding the girl's eyes as best she could. There would be more. She knew that. Many more. The town emerged from the snow, gradually revealing itself in fragments as they drew closer. A roofline here, a chimney there. The shapes of buildings buried under feet of white, looking less like a settlement than like a graveyard of geometric stones. Smoke rose from only a handful of chimneys. The rest were cold and silent, their inhabitants either dead or too depleted to maintain their fires. "Where is your house?" Elsa asked. Nell pointed with a trembling hand toward a structure that had once been the pride of the settlement. Virgil Crandall's masterpiece cabin, the finest example of frontier architecture for miles around. It did not look like a masterpiece now. The snow had piled against its walls, drifting up past the windows. Ice crystals coated every surface, giving the building a ghostly, abandoned appearance. And even from a distance, Elsa could see that something was wrong with the structure itself. The walls seemed to be bowing, slightly stressed beyond their design limits by forces they had never been built to withstand. They pushed through the snow to the door and found it frozen shut. Elsa had to kick it repeatedly, shattering the ice that had sealed it closed before it finally swung inward. The interior was a nightmare. The cold had invaded completely. Every surface was coated with frost, including the interior walls, the furniture, the blankets that the family had wrapped themselves in. The cast iron stove, the pride of the Crandall household, sat cold and empty, surrounded by the splintered remains of chairs and table legs that had been burned for fuel. And huddled in the corner, wrapped in every piece of fabric they owned, were the Crandalls. Virgil, the master builder, looked nothing like the man who had mocked Elsa from horseback. He was gaunt and hollow-eyed, his face covered with frost, his body shaking with violent tremors. His wife lay beside him, barely conscious, her lips blue and her breath coming in shallow gasps. Two children, both younger than Nell, were pressed between their parents. They were not moving. Father Nell cried, rushing to the huddled group, "Father, I found help. I found Elsa." Virgil's eyes focused slowly as if coming back from a great distance. He looked at his daughter, then at the figure standing behind her in the doorway. Recognition dawned, and with it something that Elsa had never expected to see on that proud face. Shame. "The girl," he whispered, his voice cracked and broken. "The girl from the pit. She has a house," Nell said urgently. "A warm house, underground. We have to go there. We have to go now." Virgil stared at Elsa for a long moment. His mouth opened and closed several times, as if he wanted to say something, but could not find the words. Then his wife moaned a weak, pitiful sound, and his children stirred slightly, and the master builder made his decision. "Help me," he said. "Help me get them up." They half-carried, half-dragged the family through the snow. It was slow, agonizing work. The two younger children had to be carried entirely, their small bodies limp and unresponsive. Virgil stumbled every few steps, his strength completely depleted by days of cold and hunger. But they made it. Somehow impossibly, they made it to the haystack that concealed Elsa's home. Virgil stared at the structure, his builder's eye trying to make sense of what he was seeing. "Under there," he asked, his voice incredulous. "Under there," Elsa confirmed. "Now move." She went first, showing them how to navigate the entrance tunnel. Then Nell, then the children passed hand to hand through the narrow passage. Then Mrs. Crandall, barely conscious but still breathing. And finally Virgil, who had to squeeze his large frame through an opening designed for someone much smaller. They emerged into the main chamber, and Elsa watched their faces as they took in what she had built. The clay stove glowed orange with its steady fire. The air was warm, actually warm after days of deadly cold. The walls were smooth and dry, the ceiling supported by sturdy beams, the floor covered with dried grass that provided cushioning and additional insulation. It was not a hole in the ground. It was a home. Virgil Crandall, the master builder who had called this place a grave, who had predicted that Elsa would be dead by Christmas, stood in the center of the small room and looked around with an expression of complete bewilderment. How he whispered, "How is this possible?" Elsa did not answer. She was too busy wrapping the children in blankets, positioning them near the stove, trying to bring warmth back to small bodies that had been cold for too long. Mrs. Crandall was reviving, the color slowly returning to her cheeks as the heat penetrated her frozen limbs. She looked around with dazed eyes, unable to comprehend what she was seeing. "Where are we?" she asked. "Somewhere safe," Elsa replied. "Somewhere the storm cannot reach." She brewed tea from dried mint leaves using snow melted over the stove. She gave each of them small sips, warming them from the inside out. She checked their hands and feet for frostbite, finding some damage, but nothing that would require amputation. They would live. All of them would live. But the ordeal was not over. As the Crandalls huddled around the stove, warming themselves and staring at their surroundings with disbelieving eyes, there was a sound from the entrance tunnel. Someone else was coming. Marcus Thornwood crawled into the chamber like a man emerging from his own grave. He was barely recognizable as the cold, imperious land agent who had evicted Elsa from her home. His face was a mask of frost and desperation, his fine clothes reduced to frozen rags, his body shaking so violently that he could barely move. Behind him came his wife, a woman Elsa had seen only at a distance, and two small children. A boy of perhaps 7 and a girl even younger. The boy was not moving. His mother carried him, his small body limp in her arms, his face the color of old snow. Thornwood collapsed on the floor of the chamber, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked up and saw Elsa standing over him, and something in his eyes broke. "Please," he said. The word came out at a croak barely audible. "Please, my son." Elsa looked at the child in the mother's arms, looked at the face that was too pale, too still, looked at the chest that was rising and falling in tiny, shallow movements. The boy was alive. Barely, but alive. "Bring him here," she said, pointing to the warmest spot by the stove. She worked on the child for an hour, rubbing his limbs to restore circulation, breathing warm air onto his face, wrapping him in every blanket she could spare. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the color began to return to his cheeks. His breathing deepened. His eyelids fluttered. He was going to survive. Thornwood watched the entire process in silence, his face a study in emotions that Elsa could not entirely read. Gratitude, certainly. Relief. But also something else. Something that looked like the total collapse of everything he had believed about himself and the world. When the boy finally opened his eyes and called weakly for his mother, Thornwood buried his face in his hands and wept. It was not the weeping of relief alone. It was the weeping of a man confronting his own failures, his own blindness, his own cruelty. The weeping of a man who had sent a girl to her death and was now watching that same girl save his son's life. He wept for a long time, and Elsa let him. The night wore on, and more survivors found their way to the haystack. Word had spread through the devastated town, passed from house to house by those who still had the strength to move. The orphan girl was alive. She had shelter. She had warmth. They came one at a time or in small groups. Families dragging themselves through the snow, following directions given by others who had made the journey before them. The entrance tunnel saw a steady stream of desperate humanity crawling toward the warmth that waited within. Elsa's small chamber was not designed to hold this many people, but necessity has a way of overriding design. Bodies pressed against bodies, sharing warmth, sharing air, sharing the simple fact of survival. By midnight, 17 people were crammed into the underground dwelling. 17 survivors of a storm that had killed many times that number. 17 human beings who owed their lives to a girl they had mocked and abandoned. The air grew thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and wet clothing. The temperature rose as the mass of humanity added its own heat to the warmth of the clay stove. It was cramped and uncomfortable, and nothing like the peaceful solitude that Elsa had grown accustomed to. But everyone was alive. Everyone was warm. And that was what mattered. In the crowded darkness, illuminated only by the orange glow of the stove, Virgil Crandall finally found his voice. "I do not understand," he said, his words barely above a whisper. "I have built houses all my life. I know construction. I know how to fight the elements. And yet this," he gestured at the earthen walls, "this should not work. This is impossible." Elsa looked at him, at the man who had laughed at her from horseback, who had called her work a gopher hole, who had predicted with complete confidence that she would freeze to death. "You tried to fight the wind," she said simply. "I learned to hide from it. But how does a hole in the ground stay warm when a proper cabin freezes?" She reached for her grandmother's journal, the cracked leather cover warm from being near the stove. She opened it to one of the diagrams, holding it so that Crandall could see by the firelight. "The earth is not your enemy," she said. "It is your greatest ally. But you have to work with it, not against it," she explained, as she had explained to Nell the principles of thermal mass and insulation. She showed him the diagrams of the ventilation system, the double pipes that brought fresh air in, while removing smoke without creating drafts. She described how the massive layer of hay above them was trapping their heat, preventing it from escaping into the frozen air above. Crandall listened with the intensity of a man whose entire understanding of his craft was being overturned. He asked questions, detailed technical questions, that showed he was genuinely trying to understand rather than simply dismissing what he was hearing. "My grandmother wrote this," Elsa said, closing the journal. "She came from Denmark, where the winters are long and cold. Her people learned these things generations ago. They understood that the earth remembers warmth, that it holds heat the way a stone holds the sun." She looked around at the crowded room, at the faces illuminated by firelight, at the people who were alive because of wisdom that had traveled across an ocean and through generations to reach this moment. "You all forgot," she continued. "You came to this land with your iron stoves and your timber frames, and you thought you could conquer the winter with brute force. But you cannot conquer winter. You can only endure it. And the earth knows how to endure better than any of us." Silence fell over the chamber. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the slow, steady breathing of 17 people who were finally, for the first time in days, warm enough to relax. Then Marcus Thornwood spoke. "I sent you to D." His voice was flat, emotionless. He was not looking at Elsa. He was staring into the fire, his face haunted by something he could not escape. "I looked at you, a 16-year-old orphan, with no one to protect her, and I sent you out to die. I knew what I was doing. I knew that there was no place for you that winter would take you. And I did it anyway because it was convenient, because you were a problem that I wanted someone else to solve." He finally looked up, meeting her eyes. "I was wrong," he said, "about everything. About you, about what was possible, about what I understood of this world and how to live in it." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper, creased and worn from being carried. "This is the deed to the land where we are sitting right now," he said. 40 acres, including this parcel and the one beside it. "I had it prepared weeks ago to sell to a speculator who wanted to expand his holdings." He held it out to her. "It is yours," he said. "Free and clear, no conditions. The debt that your guardians owed, the debt I used as an excuse to evict you, I am voiding it, officially and permanently." Elsa looked at the paper but did not take it. "And what else?" she asked. Thornwood blinked. "I do not understand." "You are offering me land," Elsa said. "Land that I have already claimed with my labor and my survival. You are offering to void a debt that I never owed in the first place, since I was not a party to my guardian's agreements with your company." She leaned forward, her eyes fixed on his. What else are you offering, Mr. Thornwood? The land agent was silent for a long moment. The other survivors watched, barely breathing, as the two faced each other across the firelit space. What do you want? Thornwood finally asked. I want you to learn, Elsa replied. I want all of you to learn. I want you to understand what I have built here and why it works and how you can build the same thing for yourselves. She looked around the room, making eye contact with each of the survivors in turn. I will take your land, she continued, and I will teach anyone who wants to learn how to survive on this prairie, not by fighting the earth, but by working with it, not by trying to conquer winter, but by learning to endure it. She turned back to Thornwood. That is my price, she said. You will listen, you will learn, and you will teach others what I teach you, so that what happened here, what happened in the storm, never happens again. Thornwood looked at her for a long moment. Then slowly he nodded. Agreed, he said. He held out the deed again. And this is still yours. You earned it. This time, Elsa took the paper. She folded it carefully and tucked it inside her dress next to her grandmother's journal. Then we have a bargain, she said. The storm had broken, the worst was over. But for the people huddled in that underground room, the real work was just beginning. When morning came gray and cold, but no longer actively hostile, the survivors emerged from Elsa's shelter into a world transformed by disaster. The town was devastated. Nearly half the buildings had suffered serious damage from the storm. Their walls bowed or collapsed under the weight of the snow and the force of wind. The rest were intact, but had been stripped of anything that could burn their interiors, frozen and damaged beyond easy repair. The human toll was worse. They found bodies throughout the settlement, frozen in drifts, slumped in doorways, huddled in corners of houses where the cold had finally won. Men and women and children taken by a storm they had no way to fight. The children were the hardest, small bodies found in schoolhouses and on roads caught in the open when the blizzard hit. The storm would come to be known as the school children's blizzard, and the name would carry the weight of all those small frozen faces for generations to come. Elsa helped where she could. She showed people how to move the bodies, how to prepare them for burial when the ground finally thawed enough to dig graves. She organized work parties to clear snow and salvage what could be salvaged from the damaged buildings. And she began to teach. It started small. Crandall, true to the bargain that Thornwood had made on behalf of the community, came to her with questions. Technical questions about construction and insulation, about ventilation and thermal mass. She answered them all, drawing diagrams in the snow, pointing to features of her own dwelling, explaining the principles that her grandmother had documented so carefully in that cracked leather journal. Crandall listened with the humility of a man who had been completely humbled. He took notes. He asked follow-up questions. He went away and thought about what he had learned, then came back with more questions. Others followed. Survivors who had spent that terrible night in Elsa's shelter, who had experienced firsthand the difference between her approach and the conventional wisdom that had nearly killed them all. Word spread beyond the immediate settlement. People from neighboring towns, having heard stories of the girl who had saved 17 lives with a hole in the ground, came to see for themselves. Some came skeptically, expecting to find exaggeration or fraud. They left as converts, carrying away knowledge that would change how they built and how they lived. The spring thaw revealed the full extent of the disaster. The death toll was staggering, not just in this settlement, but across the entire region. Hundreds dead, perhaps thousands. Families destroyed, communities shattered. But in the shadow of Sentinel's Bluff, where Elsa had built her impossible home, something new was being born. Crandall organized the first construction crew. A dozen men, using techniques that Elsa taught them, began digging into a south-facing slope at the edge of town. They followed her specifications, exactly creating a dwelling that burrowed into the earth rather than standing against the wind. The work went slowly at first. The men were not accustomed to this kind of construction, and they made mistakes that had to be corrected. But Crandall proved to be an excellent student, translating Elsa's principles into practical instructions that the workers could follow. By midsummer, the first new house was complete, an earth-sheltered dwelling covered with sui and crowned with a great stack of hay, invisible from a distance and warm as a mother's embrace. The family that moved in reported their experience to anyone who would listen. The temperature inside was comfortable, even on the hottest days, cool and pleasant without any effort. The air was fresh, circulating through the ventilation system exactly as Elsa had designed. And the fuel requirements were minimal, a fraction of what a conventional house would need. Other houses followed. Families who had lost their homes in the blizzard, who faced the prospect of another winter in damaged or inadequate shelters, chose to build underground instead. Each new dwelling was a testament to the wisdom that Elsa had brought from the old country, filtered through generations of harsh experience. They called them earth houses or sometimes Elsa's comforts. They became a distinctive feature of the landscape, these gentle mounds, with their crowns of hay scattered across the prairie like sleeping giants. The old ways did not disappear entirely. Some people clung to their timber frames and their cast iron stoves, unwilling or unable to embrace a new way of building. But each winter that passed proved the superiority of the earth-sheltered approach, and each spring brought more converts. Marcus Thornwood kept his word. He became an advocate for the new building methods, using his position with the railroad to spread information to other settlements along the line. He wrote letters to territorial officials describing what had happened in the blizzard and how the adoption of earth-sheltered construction could prevent similar disasters in the future. He never fully recovered from the shame of what he had done to Elsa. The knowledge that he had sent her today and that she had saved his son's life in return weighed on him for the rest of his days. But he channeled that shame into action, into making amends through work rather than words. Virgil Crandall experienced a similar transformation. The master builder who had mocked Elsa's folly became its greatest champion, adapting his considerable skills to the new techniques and teaching others what he had learned. He never built another above-ground cabin. Every structure that bore his name from that point forward was an earth house built to last and to shelter its inhabitants from the worst that winter could deliver. And Nell Crandall, the 10-year-old girl who had shown kindness when no one else would, became Elsa's first and most devoted student. She learned everything that Elsa could teach her about reading the earth, about understanding the principles of heat and cold, about building structures that worked with nature rather than against it. The years passed. Seasons turned. The prairie went through its endless cycles of growth and dormancy, heat and cold, plenty and scarcity. Elsa Dahl never married. She had offers more than a few as her reputation grew and her status in the community shifted from outcast to sage. But she declined them all, preferring her solitude, preferring the company of the earth to the complications of human partnership. She did not become wealthy, at least not in terms of money, but she accumulated something more valuable than currency. She accumulated respect, trust, the deep abiding gratitude of people whose lives she had saved and whose futures she had secured. She became the grandmother of the entire settlement, the keeper of wisdom that had saved them all. Children who had never known the old ways, who had grown up in earth houses and thought nothing of them, would still come to visit her in the small dwelling beneath the hay. They would sit by her clay stove and listen to her stories about the old country, about the blizzard, about the time when the people thought you could fight winter with iron and pride. She would show them her grandmother's journal, its pages now worn thin from decades of handling. She would trace the diagrams with fingers that had grown gnarled with age, explaining principles that had once seemed like madness and were now accepted truth. The earth remembers, she would tell them, repeating the words that Ingrid had written so many years ago. It remembers where the water flows and where the wind scours. It remembers the warmth of summer and the cold of winter. Our job is to listen, to learn, to work with what the earth knows instead of trying to impose our own foolish ideas upon it. The children would nod solemnly, not entirely understanding, but sensing the importance of what they were hearing. And then they would run off to play, to explore the underground passages in earthen rooms that were as natural to them as the sky above. And Elsa would sit by her fire and smile knowing that the wisdom had been passed on, that the lessons would not be forgotten, that the sacrifices of the past had purchased a future that was safer and warmer and more secure. On a morning in late autumn, many decades after the blizzard that had changed everything, an old woman sat at the entrance to her earth house and watched the sun rise over the prairie. Elsa Dahl was past 80 now. Her hair had gone white, her body had bent under the weight of years, her hands trembled when she tried to do the fine work that had once come so easily. But her eyes were still clear, and her mind was still sharp, and her heart was still full of the fierce determination that had carried her through so much. The settlement had grown beyond anything she could have imagined in those dark days after her eviction. It was a proper town now with stores and a school and a church with a real steeple. The railroad brought visitors from the east, curious travelers who had heard stories about the strange community where people lived in houses that grew from the ground. They would come to see Elsa, these visitors, would ask her to tell her story, to show them the original dwelling that had started it all. She would oblige when she had the energy, leading them through the entrance tunnel into the room that had saved 17 lives, pointing out the clay stove that still worked, the ventilation pipes that still drew perfectly, the earthen walls that still held their warmth after all these years. They would leave shaking their heads in wonder, unable to quite believe that this old woman, this slight weathered figure, had built all of this with her own hands when she was just a girl. But Elsa knew the truth. She had not done it alone. She had done it with the help of a grandmother she had never met, whose wisdom had reached across death and distance to save her life. She had done it with the help of a 10-year-old girl who had shown kindness when kindness was rare. She had done it with the help of the earth itself, which had kept its promise, which had remembered its warmth, which had sheltered her from storms both physical and metaphorical. On this particular morning, Elsa was not alone. Nell Crandall sat beside her, no longer a child, but a grandmother herself, now her own hair silvered by time, her own hands marked by decades of work. They had grown old together, these two. The orphan and the builder's daughter, bound by a connection that had formed in the darkest days of their lives and had only strengthened with the passing years. "Do you remember," Nell asked, looking out at the prairie that was just beginning to turn gold with the approach of autumn, "remember what the first time I came to see you, after the storm, when I thought you were dead, and then I found you alive, and you told me to bring everyone?" Elsa smiled, the expression deepening the lines on her face. "I remember," she said. "I remember being afraid that there would not be enough room, that I could not save everyone, that I would fail. But you did not fail." "No," Elsa agreed, "we did not fail." They sat in companionable silence, watching the sun climb higher, watching the light spread across a landscape that had been shaped by the wisdom they had shared. Far in the distance, a child's laughter echoed across the prairie, the sound of play, of innocence, of a future that was possible only because of what had been built in the past. "The earth remembers," Elsa said softly, speaking the words one more time. "And so do we," Nell replied. "So do we." The old women sat together in the morning light, two survivors of a storm that had killed so many guardians of a wisdom that had saved so many more. Behind them, beneath its crown of hay, the earth house waited, patient and warm, and ready as it had been for decades, as it would be for decades more. Ready to shelter whoever needed sheltering. Ready to teach whoever wanted to learn. Ready to prove again and again that the greatest power comes not from standing against the storm, but from knowing how to disappear into the arms of the earth, safe and warm until it passes. The wind picked up slightly, carrying the scent of autumn, the promise of another winter to come. But there was no fear in that promise anymore. Only readiness, only wisdom, only the deep abiding knowledge that they would endure, because the earth remembered. And because of Elsa Dahl, they remembered too.